Hello, we're going to continue our discussion of seminal research studies and link them to ethics here as we look at the study done by Stanley Milgram. Now, this is a picture of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was the architect of the Holocaust, basically. He was the one that sat at a desk and arranged for the deportation of thousands and millions of Jews to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. He, after the war, had escaped to Argentina and was arrested in 1960. In 1961, he was put on trial in Israel, and in 1962, he was hanged for his crimes. The thing that struck many people who also were lawyers in the Nuremberg trials right after the war, and even for those watching Eichmann, was how was it that ordinary people could follow the instructions of someone like Eichmann, who basically sat at a desk and said, now we're going to carry out a giant extermination. And so really this plagued a lot of social psychologists in the 1960s, and they wanted to study, is there something fundamental about the human condition that will make someone obey an authority figure, even if they know that they're hurting that person. So Stanley Milgram actually designed a research study, and the setup will look a little bit more on the next slide, so don't worry about that right now. But he put an ad into the New Haven paper and basically asked for people to come and participate in a research study on memory. So he is using deception here, which, as we've talked about, is okay. He looks for a cross-section of people from a variety of backgrounds, and even, tells them that they'll get paid $4 plus 50 cents car fare to participate. So he's getting a fairly good cross-section, random sample of the population. Now, once they arrive, here's the setup of the room. We have the experimenter. This is the person who is running the quote memory research. And we have the student who is actually working for the researcher. So the student has a script, they know what they're supposed to say at each step along the way. And then we have the teacher, and the teacher is the subject. This is the person that we're watching. So what happens is that two people show up, they meet with the experimenter, they draw straws, and one of them will end up being the student and one the teacher. Now, of course, it looks random, but it's already figured out that the person who's the confederate is going to take the part of the student. They take the teacher, in other words, the subject, into the room where the student will be strapped into this chair, and in fact, they give the teacher a little shock. Now, what they've done is they have attached the student to a machine that the teacher is controlling. And this is what the machine actually looked like. This is a copy of the machine. On this machine, there are numerous switches, and the switches are identified down here, go up in intensity of shock each time that the student does a memory task inaccurately. So the teacher will read a list of words, and the student then is to read back the list of words, thus demonstrating their memory. Uh, the question is, what is the teacher going to do? If you look at this panel here, you can see that the level of shocks get increasingly intense. In fact, they get so intense that at some point the student here stops speaking or yelling or screaming altogether. And in fact, the teacher, in many cases, believed that the student had died. This is tremendously controversial from an ethical standpoint because of the undue stress placed upon the teacher who is acting as the subject and thinking that they perhaps have actually injured somebody. Now, Milgram will say that follow-up many years later showed that no one had an ill effect from this experiment. However, there are other sources that say that there were some people that were terribly troubled by the results of this study and the fact that they indeed thought that they had hurt somebody just at the command of this experimenter, who merely said the only words that he said really were, the experiment requires that you continue. So we're going to watch an excerpt from this study right now.
Nazis were the result of total blind obedience to a leader was elicited in a controversial laboratory experiment by this researcher, Stanley Milgram, a former student of Solomon Asch. Milgram wondered whether the evil deeds of the Nazis were the result of their personal defects, or whether anyone has the capacity for evil if the situation is powerful enough. In 1961, when Hitler's henchman Adolf Eichmann was standing trial for war crimes, Milgram wanted to find out how far ordinary people would go in obeying orders. Would they, like Eichmann, execute strangers if they were told to? In Milgram's experiment, a subject was paid to participate in what he thought was a study of memory. He was asked to play the role of teacher, helping someone improve his memory.
You want to step right in here, learner, and have a seat there. You can leave your coat on the back of that chair. Take it right off.
Guiding the subject was the experimenter in the lab coat, who acted as the legitimate authority in the situation. Both the experimenter and the man being tested as the learner were part of Milgram's team. And how was the subject supposed to help the learner improve his memory? By delivering electric shocks as punishment for every mistake.
This machine generates electric shocks, and when you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock.
The shocks began as mild, but they had to be increased with each era until they were potentially lethal. Although no shocks were actually given, the teacher subject was made to think he was punishing the learner.
Let me out of here! You have no right to keep me here! Let me out! Let me out of here! Let me out!
Continue, please.
Let me out of here! Let me out!
Go on.
Let me out!
Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out!
boy.
Let me out of here! My heart bothers me. Let me out, I tell you! Let me out of here! Let me out of here! You have no right to hold me
The
here!
next phrase is fast.
Let me out! Let me out! Let me out of here! Let me
Bird,
out!
car, train, plane. Continue, teacher.
What would you do in this situation? Would you continue?
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird. The next one, blunt.
At the time, 40 experts were asked to predict the performance of the subjects. They estimated that most would not go beyond 150 volts, and only 1 in 1,000, the sadists, would go all the way to 450 volts. In fact, 2/3 of the subjects went all the way. While many of them objected, the majority did not disobey. I asked Stanley Milgram how many of the subjects who quit the experiment ever got up to help the learner without first getting the experimenter's permission. He said, not one, not ever. So blind obedience is not limited to the fascist mentality. It's part of the basic human condition, brought out by situational forces. Hundreds and hundreds of subjects obeyed the experimenter, men and women, young and old. As the author C.P. Snow wrote, when you think of the long and gloomy history of man, you'll find more hideous crimes have been committed in the name of obedience than have been committed in the name of rebellion. Whenever we try to understand some unusual aspect of human behavior, like that of the Nazi guards or the subjects in the obedience experiment, we typically explain it in terms of personal traits, without sufficiently considering the impact of the situation. This dual tendency to attribute the causes of behavior to personal factors while underestimating the effects of the situation is known as the fundamental attribution error.
So, as in the prison study, we do commit the fundamental attribution error and we fail to take into account the effect of the situation. Now, the type of obedience response that these people experienced and that they displayed, some people have thought, well, that was then and this is now, and people aren't like that anymore. And unfortunately, there are a number of instances, both publicly and in research, that shows that people are still willing to obey an authority figure, whether it's some military incidents that we've maybe heard about, or even just in social pressure situations. But let's continue to look back at the results of Milgram's study. It was rather shocking, no pun intended, but it is shocking to see that 2/3 of the participants administered the full level of shock that was available. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned before, the person who was in the room, the person who played the role of the learner, had long since stopped even responding, and they continued to administer the shock. Numerous replications have confirmed these findings. This study has been replicated in many forms with slight variations, and they do show a strong tendency towards obedience to authority, even when the experiment was done at somewhere less prestigious than Yale. Some would say, well, it's just because it was done at Yale, that's why they did it. But even in less prestigious settings, the obedience rate was still very, very high. Levels of obedience are impacted by a couple of things. First of all, proximity and status of the authority figure. In this original study, the authority figure was right there standing next to the subject who was acting the role of the teacher. In that case, we are far more likely to obey the authority figure. If the authority, however, was on the phone and called and told them to make the shock, they were far less likely to obey. Also, perceived similarity to the victim. This is one of the reasons why many believe that the Holocaust succeeded. It wasn't really something you'd call a success, but many people obeyed because the Jewish people, had been so marginalized in society and made to be the others. And so when we have a perceived similarity to the victim or a connection with them, we're less likely to obey an authority to hurt them. The proximity of the learner or victim also affected obedience. So for example, if the learner was sitting right next to the teacher, and in fact the teacher could reach out and touch the learner, the teacher was far less likely to obey, seeing that the learner was in such distress. And also the presence of dissenters affects obedience as well. If there are other people that say, hey, I am not going to participate in this, then others are likely to also not participate. Now, I do want to add, because I haven't mentioned this yet, the learner never actually was shocked. The learner was completely following a script about how he should sound at each level of shock. Nevertheless, this does point out to us a really important fundamental concept about human behavior, and that is the fact that we seem to have hardwired into us a capacity to obey authority. Evolutionary psychologists would say that this is probably something that we needed as a society in order to have people get along and to be able to work together. Now, I am going to move on to our next topic, which is human research ethics, and I will continue that on our next video.